Lucy Gans, she, her. I'm a professor of art at Lehigh University in the Department of Art and Architecture and Design, and an affiliated faculty in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. I think in the same way all people are introduced to art, it's something that we all want to do when we are small. And at some point in our school training or family training, that gets diverted to writing or other kinds of expression. And for me, it just never left. As it turns out, my mother was an artist, although I didn't think of her as such. She did portraits in our dining room of my friends and people. So, art educator, I didn't actually think about that. I went through graduate school. I did not have a teaching assistantship. I worked as a shop assistant and a tech assistant and had no intention of teaching, but was invited back by my undergraduate school to teach for a year. And I think after that year, I decided that teaching was not for me. But as time went on, it worked out, and I got to learn how to teach and how to communicate with people. I love it so much. I'm not retired yet, and I should be. So if you are in school and doing your own work, you think about yourself and how to express yourself, and you're really determined to get your own voice out there to the point that you want to almost shield yourself from the voices of others. But if you're teaching and you do that, you're not teaching anybody. What's great about it is you're in a room, a seminar, a studio with 20 other eyes and ears and thoughts and background, and everybody has a different take on it, and it expands your own worldview. You know, it's sort of like taking a piece of sculpture and looking at it from all sides, but then how does it look when you put it on the floor and above your head, hearing what other people have to say in terms of their interpretation. It's really enriched how I look at my own work and the work of others when I go to galleries and museums. I used to be a sculptor and carved wood, and most of it was figurative, sort of classical, non-gendered, except when they were goddess figures. And I created little villages you could walk through with huts and strings and sticks, etc., and then made drawings. And I did that for years and years, and slowly have gone from the drawings into printmaking. And I was sort of looking at things because I'm going to have a show in about a year and a half. And I realized that I took some photographs of some of my sculptural installations, and then I took those photographs, developed them on paper, and drew into them and created new images. I'm doing printmaking. I take photographs or use photographs that my family takes, and I manipulate those photographs, and then I make a plate from those photographs, and then I print those and layer them and try and get the same kind of personal narrative. Specifically now, I'm doing a combination of polymer lithography and photopolymer intaglio. So I'm developing a photograph onto either a thin polymer plate or onto a steel back photopolymer plate. Develop them so that one of them is like an intaglio where it's eaten in, and the other one is planographic where it's flat, and I then print them up. I also use text on top, which I sometimes cut in, or use a solar plate like a letterpress. Sometimes I write it. Sometimes I use my old typewriter and type into it. As an undergraduate, I took a lot of art history, and as a graduate student, I took a lot of art history. And I would be sitting there in the lecture hall. We called it Art in the Dark. It was a big lecture hall, professor male down at the end, and showing us slides and talking ad nauseum about the images up there. And 90% of the figurative images we saw were of women, and I would say 99.5% of the people that we saw that were the artists were men. And the pathetic part of it was this was a women's college, and we were sitting there going, where are the women? And I think in my art history, we heard about George O'Keeffe and Mary Cassatt, and that was it. When I was hired by my undergraduate school to come back after I'd finished my graduate degree, I said, we need a course on women artists. And they said, oh, go right ahead. And there were no textbooks. All the textbooks got published in the late 70s, so now you know how old I am. It was 1975, and Judy Chicago's Through the Flower, which was her autobiography, came out. So we didn't have a text. I found writings by women artists. I turned it into part seminar, part studio, and then had people do research into women artists. I was out near Cleveland. The Cleveland Museum was a wonderful resource. Sooner or later, I found some books, but it was too late to have a text. That's how it started. At the other institutions I taught at, until I came to Lehigh, there was no desire for me to do that. When I came here, they gave me free rein and said, go ahead. By that time, there were few texts. The course has grown and changed over the years. It's become, add more. I can't take anything away. So the text that I use is Women Artists in Society. When it started, it was probably 200 pages. Now I think it's like 500 or 600 because they keep adding more. But I want particularly students to do research on women artists that are intriguing to them. And then I want to be sure that for our trans students and our queer students and our gay students, that they can find artists that appeal to them. We have been searching for that and including that. We have a really active architecture program. I would give my colleagues a whole section on women in architecture, women architects. I brought in an alum who is a really successful architect in New York City, and we had a dialogue in Women in Art about women in architecture and how difficult it's been for them and still is for them to be partners in firms unless it's a totally women-owned firm. And I do remind my colleagues of different artists that are out there and should be included. Art has been produced by all people, and it hasn't always been from the same social class, the same race, the same gender, same ethnicity. Art is cross-cultural, and it's this wonderful form of nonverbal communication that everyone can respond to. So a child can to someone who is a scholar in the field. It's really important to be able to hear the voices or see the images of all types of people. They were there. I think that if we're talking about the Renaissance forward, we know that there were women working, and slowly but surely they are uncovered. A lot of times what would happen in the early days, a studio, someone like Michelangelo or Raphael had a studio where they were creating works and they had men and women in there. There was an educational system that excluded women. Women weren't allowed to read and write, much less be artists. But the women were there, they were making it, they weren't necessarily signing. It was very often daughters of and spouses of artists that were in these workshops. And then slowly what happened was art was a commodity with value, and collectors wanted to collect that which was worth the most. Usually they had one thing in the collection or it was in that museum. And women's art was not considered as valuable. So it's in the back of the museums, it's in private collections. But slowly but surely, it's resurfaced. And there was an amazing exhibition, women artists, 1550 to 1950, that sort of woke everybody up. And it was in the 70s or the 80s, but it really woke people up as to how many women artists there were out there. And the textbooks are slowly getting revised. But I'm going to just pop forward. For instance, this year, for the first time, not the first time it's been a woman, but for the first time at the Venice Biennale, Simone Lee, who's an African-American woman, sculptor who works in ceramics, is representing the U.S. in the pavilion. And that's like a milestone. She's been on the covers of the New York Times Magazine, all these different things. People are promoting her. She's got public art in New York City, working in Philadelphia. She's come up to everybody's consciousness. So the women were there. They were just standing behind their man, father, etc. They couldn't sign contracts. How do you do a commission if you can't get paid and can't sign a contract? So once social laws changed, we started to discover there were more of them. I think that in some ways, because of the time for me, it was a little bit of an advantage because, for instance, with job interviews, all the people sitting out in the hallway were white men. Yes, I was a white woman, but they had to sort of count me a little bit. I do think it has historically been a disadvantage. I think that, and this is just the way I work, women have a tendency to put some things ahead of their work. Family, spouse, relationships. It's not that they don't do them, but they put them on the back burner. They schedule their one-person shows when they can in between things. They have their studio at home instead of outside of the house. So there are all these different things that if you want to go into the gallery system, they wanted you to make a consistent body of work over not a really long period of time, but a sort of shortish period of time. And if you had family or cared for an elder parent or things like that, that was often difficult. And so lots of times women had to make a choice. Are they going to just go in there and work really hard and make sure that they get their work out there, and then they end up by being forgotten or remembered as Jackson Pollock's wife? So no, completely and totally, because they're commercial and they want to be able to sell and they want to have a consistent degree of output, and say they sell these things, they want to be sure that there's more where that came from, and no, they don't want to think of you back home having a baby not being available to them. And to be clear, I have a lot of friends who have done this as a dual partnership, that the male partner has stayed home, cared for the kids, done their work, whereas she has gone out and gotten the job outside of the home to support the family. Unless it's the very high percentage of artists that sell a lot, it's a pretty hard business, and it's pretty hard to make a living in that business. I think that there was a period of time when there was patronage by the church and by kings. It was a good thing to be an artist, and therefore that we have the collections of those things. But I also read some kind of social mores who said if you bring an artist to your house, and this was like in the 20s to the 50s, make sure they only come in the back door. Don't give them any dinner because they'll stay forever. And it was sort of this whole thing of their riffraff. And I think that there has been a social stigma against artists. That was more against male artists. The sense of art being a feminine thing, with the exception of those who really make it, it's not a lucrative way to make a living. It's hard to understand that it's, the sort of standard steps to get there. This is the degree you have. This is the company you work for. This is how you go about it. There are no straight paths like that. And art has always been thought of as expressive, emotive, innate, and all those things. Men are supposed to conquer those urges in themselves and divorce themselves from their expressive, emotive, emotional sides. And therefore, when they don't, their parents think they're suspect, not their faculty, but I think that that's what it's all about. Women have a little bit of permission to do these things because anything that is considered innate is okay for women to do. I think the only so-called innate thing that it's okay for men to do is maybe play aggressive sports. I don't know. I mean, that's really going on very strict perceived gender lines, but I think that has something to do with it. If you think about it, all kids love to draw. They smear the stuff and they all go about it different ways. And then sooner or later, when I was in school, the boys got tracked to a shop class and the girls got tracked to an art class because the boys had to be practical and the girls could be decorative and etc. And art wasn't thought of as a serious profession. There is definitely a discrepancy as to who gets the galleries, who the museums are going to buy or collect, because the museums don't pay very much. But if a museum is starting to collect you, then your prices go way, way up, and galleries want you. Right now, when I look at the galleries, they are still predominantly male who's being shown, etc. Mostly I go to the galleries in New York, and they're still predominantly men of those shows, but not exclusively. It's gotten better. And what happened in the last couple of years is there's been a concerted effort towards artists of color, which is way, way overdue. So if women are excluded, Black and brown people are excluded even more. I'm going to go back to Simone Lee and then Jennifer Packer, who had this amazing exhibition just this fall at the Whitney Museum and is in Young, Gifted, and Black in the galleries, has been included in all kinds of things. So also I noticed that the curators for the Whitney were women. But I think curators are looking. So I haven't seen the biennial yet. I'm going to go in and see it this weekend. It's interesting to me to see who they've included. I think that the school can make sure that the women artists from the women in the classes from the very beginning get pushed hard, but not in directions that they don't want to be pushed in. It was a tradition in art school that the work that the instructor had people do was pretty much like their work. And therefore, if you've got a lot of men doing the teaching, their perspective will be imposed on the students a little bit more. So if you've got a lot of male faculty, they need to bring in visiting faculty so that they can model for students what is out there. And I think exposing all of our students to the work out there, women artists, trans artists, artists of color, all the time, so that they see that there is that, and then help students to find their voice. And I think there needs to be a way to encourage everybody to feel confident in their own voice, to push it, but also hold everybody to the same standards. And then help them with opportunities in terms of galleries. That is really crucial. Expose them to and realize that there isn't just one path. So if we talked about art as a profession, how you go about it, all the different ways that you can go about doing that. Keep working. It's hard work. There are no mistakes. There are just different paths. Save your work. You may find that you want to go back over an older piece and redo it, get inspiration from it. Just keep focused. And if you are not in sort of a tight schedule of classes, when you graduate, see if you can put aside a particular amount of studio time. You need to shut everything off. Say, okay, Fridays I'm in the studio, Saturdays I'm in the studio, one day, or I'm in the studio and I'm going to do my work from 6 in the morning until 9 in the morning. That is it. I'm unplugged, I'm doing this. But you need to inform people that this is what you do, this is who you are, and you need to establish that time period for you to be able to get your work done.